Good afternoon. Legacy of Expo 88 YouTube channel, formerly Foundation Expo 88 YouTube channel. And this is the introduction to a series of interviews which have now been converted into a podcast. The interviews were done early 2012, and this podcast is being produced in March 2024, some 12 years after the original interviews. But they are great, and we are going to talk about continuous division.
I thought we'd talk about, because that is a fairly large and major piece. And Greg, if you can just tell us just where it sits in amongst the size of your artwork. I thought that was a good place to start.
Yeah, Paul, that's certainly one of the major works I've made in Australia or overseas. So it would be up there, and there's a number of works that probably range from between say 4 metres and up to about 6 or even 8 metres. And look, I'm not sure how many, but perhaps in that scale there's been perhaps 10, 12 finished. And that would be one of the works that is up there in that range.
And that you were telling me before, as we were merrily chit-chatting, that you've actually done some work in Spain as well.
Yeah, in 2005 I did a really large commission in Ibiza. This actually consisted of an installation work of 11 works, and then a very large, two very large freestanding pieces, one about 6 metres, the other one about 6.5, and then a few smaller works as well. So that was actually a great job to do. It actually to this day still remains the largest commission, as I understand, that an Australian sculptor has done in Europe. So it was a great opportunity, that one.
Yeah, that's great, because I think you were telling me that when I think John Truscott first approached you to be involved in Expo, they wanted a major Australian piece in the entrance to Expo, and it was just opposite the South Brisbane rail station there, and it certainly was. Just along with in that stretch, there was just some worldwide amazing artists, and I think you was just so privileged to be one of those. And can you just tell us a little bit more about that part of the Expo experience?
Yeah. Oh, look, there's a whole lot of stories, Peter, and it's a really interesting one. So I think what had happened a little bit was that first of all, a larger work of mine went over from the Holmes Court collection. People seemed to, the Expo authorities, I'm not sure it was, seemed to react well to it, like that work. Then I think that was probably the main entranceway to Expo, where there were a number of works from major sculptors around the world. I think they started to realise that they didn't have an Australian representative in that group. So I got a phone call only about 6 weeks out from the opening of World Expo saying, look, we really love to have a large work of yours, but we know it can't be done now with 6 weeks to go. And I said, look, I don't know how we're going to do it, but we'll do it. So I sat down, I did some drawings, they really liked what was put forward and such. And it's a pretty amazing story, because we then made that work in 6 weeks. Actually, as the work was going onto the truck, I was hand filing the edges of it as it left Adelaide to go up there. So the work was made at DeMille Engineering. They've fabricated most of my larger works in Australia.
And still do?
And still do, right up to now. So they made this work over 6 weeks, and they worked shifts on this, and to 2, 3 a.m. in the morning, with 7 to 8 guys working on it day in and day out. So we got the piece made, and we got it made in what was a ridiculous period of time, and got the piece shipped up there, and we did it. So.
And thank God that it did, and thank God it's still in Brisbane. It's in a wonderful location. At the Roma Street Gardens. When it first was installed after Expo, it went into a position where the then Lord Mayor wanted to have certain exposure, and it got incredible exposure. And then when they redeveloped the Roma Street parklands, it was relocated into a very picturesque, very tranquil, and it's still quite a visible location. And I think in the various emails that we've done back and forth, your conservator still looks after that work, I think?
Peter Maxwell, who's a fantastic art conservator in Australia, so he's been involved in looking after that work for I think for quite a long period of time now. So what I understand is actually in quite good condition. And you know, I've made sculpture now for 37 years, and the conservation of works is a really big issue. And so you need somebody looking at, you know, probably inspecting the work perhaps once a year or something like that. But I understand that work is in good nick. Some of my other works have certainly been, you know, challenged by weather and conditions. But I spoke to Peter today, funny enough, on the phone, and I think in the next, I think it's this year he's having another look at the piece, and he's going to put another coating over it, and which only has to be done every 5 years. So yeah, it's in good nick.
Very good. And with that, good morning.
Morning.
Beautiful morning in Adelaide, and we're here in the fabrication room. And yesterday you saw Liam grinding this particular piece, and it's a suitable piece to be discussing the methods of the making of continuous division. Greg, if you can just go through the welding, the grinding, the grinding process, and just as to how and where it fits into the manufacturing process.
Yeah, well, this is quite similar really to the way continuous division would have been constructed. So what I use is a fabricating technique. It's been around for actually about the 1920s it started out of interest. It was actually so you could make large structures that were quite light. So you start off, everything comes out of flat plate, as continuous division did. You tend to use a box section, a hollow box section. There's usually 4 sides which are welded together with either arc welding or with MIG welding. We tend to use both of those. It's a pretty slow process of welding the sections up, and then as you can see probably here you get an idea that the welds initially are raised. We have to grind them, we have to use a sanding disc to get them back to quite a nice flat surface, and then with continuous division, and as with this piece, all the edges are actually hand filed at the end. With continuous division, that was actually being hand filed as it went onto the truck.
Yes, I remember that story from yesterday. And the feel and the look of your pieces, as we can see just down below here, and a piece that's naturally aged, you were a little bit worried, given the time frames, because they're very tight time frames, from giving you the commission to actually getting it on site, that you didn't think that the piece would have aged adequately enough, but that is not the way that you discovered it worked, is it?
Yeah, well, World Expo is sort of making my memory banks sort of come back into play now. And World Expo back in '88, one thing they did say was, look, we had a 6-week period to make the work, as I said before, but they said, look, anything, we can do anything. So I was worried about it, sort of, we can make the sculpture. If you see some early images, you'll see when it got up to Brisbane it was quite raw. So I was worried about the time frame. They said, if you like, we can construct like a humidity type crib over the whole sculpture out of plastic. Now when we got up to Brisbane, by luck, we installed the sculpture. We made the sculpture in 6 weeks. We installed it, and actually there was quite a big rainstorm that came in that afternoon. So that rainstorm sent the sculpture off very, very quickly. And I think within a day or two, it had good colour in it, so we didn't have to construct the humidity crib.
Yeah, and the gods were with you.
The gods were with us. Yeah.
Exactly. As they were with all of Expo, I've discovered with the stories as they're knitting together. And the colour is very important, and the colour leads us into your favourite baby, the Palmer project, which has a continuance in relation to the Expo hereditary, because obviously, you know, your big start, was from Expo, and you've been able to maintain the momentum in your career through all of its ups and downs, and you're now working on the Palmer project. Just tell us a little bit about that baby.
Yeah, well, Expo was certainly one of the, early on in the career, one of the major things, you know, I was involved with, so I was very pleased to get involved with it. The work I'm making about that time, and the World Expo piece, I certainly still regard as being a significant work, but the work was what I describe as being a bit more international in feel. So the sculpture could have been made in Australia, but it probably could have been made in America, it could have been made in Europe. My work since then, for most of my work, not quite all of it, but it has moved probably towards having a bit more of an Australian feel to it. I think this is actually important for Australian sculpture right now, that we actually develop a sense of sculpture coming out of this place. You know, I think it's actually quite a big issue. The steel I've used, I started using Core 10 steel early on, actually inspired by one of my teachers, Owen Broughton at art school. Some people think it was Clement Meadmore, but it wasn't, it was Owen Broughton. Core 10 steel though has very much the colours that we get in the Australian landscape. So once you get away from the cities, you know, you get into the interior bit, you know, what forms all those wonderful rusty colours, it's iron that does it.
Yep.
That's one reason I've used the Core 10 for such a long period of time. I think it relates to this place far better than bronze and certain other materials which were developed in Europe really. So I think Core 10 still sits very well in our landscape. And that's led on to, you know, through the last 37 years, so one of my major projects the last 10 years has been Palmer, which is 400 acres of land I bought about an hour out from Adelaide, and I've now placed close to 30 works on that property, and nearly all these works except for one have that very Australian feel to them. With the colour of the steel we use with the Core 10, I think that steel again, you know, sits in very well in that landscape. So pieces which have Australian feel form-wise and conceptually, and also through the materials I'm using as well, sort of engage that Palmer landscape, which is a very, it's a drier, what I'd call archetypal sort of Australian landscape.
It's
big
rain
rocks,
shadow, isn't it?
It's rain shadowy country,
Yeah.
more like the Flinders Ranges here, or equivalent, you know, you'd find all around Australia.
And that project, you have a biennial there. That's an association with the Adelaide Arts Festival, as I understand it. And there is, if you'd like to get in contact with Greg, and he's got a great web page, a wonderful video, which I just found fascinating last night watching it. And it just gives a great history and a great feel of the artwork, all the different types of Greg's artwork. And there's no one type which you'd say, oh, that's a Greg Johns. There is a multitude of brilliant artwork that Greg has done. So with that, we might just wrap up.
So I've inserted in this little section, for those who are watching it on YouTube and not listening to it strictly on a podcast, some amazing photos of the work being made in Adelaide before it was sent up to Brisbane.
Morning, ladies and gentlemen. We're here at the last YouTube, and I just thought we'd start off just by referencing the wonderful piece behind us here. If you can just tell us the name of that particular piece.
Yeah, this piece is called Swirling Mandala. It has also been made as a larger work. It's up in South Melbourne.
Yes, you did say last night that that was a smaller version of a much larger work. Now, the steel we referenced or spoke about previously about the steel Core 10, and I wanted to just talk about the materials of that, and then we'll start to talk a little bit about the work over in Singapore and what happens when work isn't conserved properly, because I know that in our first video you made mention the fact that Brisbane is looking after very well the continuous division, and I think it's a good homily to be talking about, well, what does happen when things aren't looked after properly. So if you can just tell us about the core ingredients of Core 10.
Yeah, well, so I've used Core 10 steel now for about 37 years. Actually, I think I can say I popularised it as a material in Australia because it's been used a lot by architects as well.
Yeah.
Core 10 steel's got a stainless steel content and a copper content in it as well.
Yeah.
So what happens is that the mould steel, which makes up most of it, tends to rust away, and then you get a matrix forming of the stainless and the copper to some extent, and that sort of stops the rusting through. It doesn't stop it altogether, but it stops it pretty well. It's pretty effective, but at the same time, probably in wetter environments, including Brisbane, it's worth giving it a bit of extra protection. Now, luckily up in Brisbane, Peter Maxwell, who I think is one of the best, you'll be pleased to hear me saying this, but one of the best conservators in Australia, he's been involved with a program of looking after my piece. And that piece is it's 3mm steel, so it's not as thick as some of the steel I use later on. So far as I know, the work's actually in very good condition. There has been a piece in Singapore recently, even though I gave them conservation advice on it and they haven't done it, and it's actually ended up with some holes in it, and we're just looking at it right now, whether we can repair it or not.
And to give people at home an idea of the value of some of these pieces in today's market. And, you know, well, I'm not putting a value on the Brisbane piece, but you were telling me that when they looked at its replacement value as such on the open market, they were very surprised as to what the actual value of the thing was. And I think you were mentioning a figure of around $500,000 or something similar to that.
That's a piece in
Singapore,
Singapore, yeah. And the look, the Brisbane work, exactly what it sold back in '88. I can't exactly remember, but look, it was only, I think it was perhaps high teens, mid-20s it might have sold for. And it's always a bit difficult to determine these things, but the I think the Brisbane work now, you know, I don't mind saying, I think the value on the sort of art market, whatever, would be sort of, I don't know, somewhere around 250 to 350,000.
Yeah, and it's a good return for the rate.
Yeah, they've done it right for them.
Which I'm sure Sally Ann Atkinson will be very happy to see her legacies grown in value as such. And the work that started out at Expo, the Expo project, we've spoken about the tight time frame, we've spoken about the aging of the steel, we've spoken about the content and the material of the steel. So I think we've had a very comprehensive look. But what I found fascinating during our discussions that you're now off to Ireland next year. Can you just tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. And just with World Expo, I should say that you know, it was a really genuinely exciting, you know, event to be involved with. There was a lot of good energy around, and I think it's known up in Brisbane, but it's certainly not generally known that, you know, I think without doubt that was the most significant exhibition of sculpture in Australia's history, with the amount of artists that came from overseas. Yeah, so for me, since World Expo, I've completed, you know, a lot of large-scale work in Australia, and actually quite a lot of projects in, you know, large works in Spain and England, in Korea and Singapore and New Zealand. So I've sort of been really pleased with that. And then as part of the Lawn Sculpture Prize I won late last year, part of that was to go to Ireland for a studio there for 6 months in Cork. Sorry, not 6 months, 6 weeks in Cork. So I'll be doing that in July to mid-August next year, which I think will be a great project, and I get a chance to look at sort of Celtic roots and Celtic art, which is already, you know, the sort of round forms have already had an influence on my work, and a lot of our own historical roots lie there as well.
It's a little bit Celtic, that piece actually.
Oh yeah. No, that's been a lot of different influences come in the work, and the, you know, the whirls and the twirls and things like that. There's a bit of Celtic stuff.
Yeah, I just realised when you were talking about that.
Yeah, no, well, I think making sculpture in Australia right now is a very interesting one, but I think you know, the influences are actually quite diverse. So for my work right now, I'd say influences from Europe, you know, still have an influence on my work, but then influences from Indigenous culture here have an influence, influences from the Australian landscape. So the sources really come in, you know, I think from perhaps 5 or 6 different directions, and that's actually going to Ireland next year.
So let's just interrupt Greg there and insert a really interesting summary of Greg John's work that John McGregor read out in front of Continuous Division. And then we'll go back to Greg and conclude the podcast.
Now, I have a particular statement here to read also from a colleague of his, Heather Elliard. And it's a very interesting statement, and it's very interesting in how it pertains to Continuous Division as well. So I'll read this out, and it talks about Greg John's work in general and how he uses space and time. So here again, this statement, which is called Essay by Heather Elliard. Sculpture occupies space. It is three-dimensional. Therefore, it exists in time. Space and time, a continuum. Anything which requires space demands time to exist in that space. Greg John's work is particularly and carefully attuned to this principle. He has, with great consistency, worked with the theme of form and space and change through time. Greg works within a framework of art historical continuity, what I call a timeline. He is making his line, his position, and he works along with it with integrity and energy. That line comes from an abstract formal tradition, Brancusi, Noguchi, Medmore, etc., using formal geometric elements, using systems and patterns without deviation, interruption or temptation, precisely and purely. He has been labelled a formalist. If we were that and nothing more, he would still be good, but he is more than structure, formal geometry, or monumental mathematics. It is what I have coined geometric metamorphosis. I mean, he uses geometry, an ancient and honourable tool, in order to explore change, both physically and metaphysically. The work stands utterly mute and monumental, yet the pieces change, move, metamorphose from one thing to another, and are present to our own movement and our own perceptions of change. The work becomes in this way symbolic of opposites correlating, lining up together, exchanging habits. The square circles, the curve straightens, the inside becomes the outside, the open closes, the contemplative teases. Greg himself calls it opposites coming together. Greg is working with a balance of opposites, and I am indicating that balance, in our time, is precarious at best. Finally, I would like to quote from Fritjof Capra, the author of a beautiful book called The Tao of Physics, published in 1975. But I must preface that when saying that Capra, as a physicist, was led to contemplative writing by this book by a profound sense of the destructive imbalance in our modern world. Capra says, "Modern physics pictures matter not at all as passive and inert, but as being in a continuous dancing and vibrating motion whose rhythmic patterns are determined by the molecular, atomic and nuclear structures. This is also the way in which the Eastern mystics see the material world. They all emphasize that the universe has to be grasped dynamically as it moves, vibrates and dances. That nature is not static, but in a dynamic equilibrium. In the words of a Taoist text, the stillness in stillness is not the real stillness. Only when there is stillness and movement can the spiritual rhythm appear which pervades heaven and earth."
And on that funny story, I think we should conclude. Look, thank you so much.
Thanks for coming over too, Peter.
Look, it's really been enjoyable, and the series of YouTubes we've done here, I think it's enlightening, and it just adds to the mix and the depth of celebrating Expo 88, the 25th anniversary. And good morning, and thank you again.